We are at risk, Catholic Christians. We are at risk. We are at risk of falling to the ways of the world. I mentioned this last week. Things like materialism, narcissism, and what St. John Paul II calls a culture of distraction. So many things to distract us. These are the kind of behaviors that prevent us from entering into an intimate relationship with God, the God who loves us, the God who is love, the God who wants to enter into our lives in the person of Jesus Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit. So during these weeks of summer, we are heading back to school, to summer school, to a school of prayer, because it's really only prayer, real, true prayer, that will connect us to divine love, that will help us from falling into the ways of the world. But what good is a school if it doesn't have a good teacher? Who's going to be our teacher? Any volunteers? Probably not. And I suppose that's good because ultimately our teacher is Jesus Christ. In today's gospel, we hear Mark telling us how the crowd gathered around him and his heart was moved with pity, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. And then Mark goes on and tells us that he began to teach them, and he taught them many things. You see, Jesus alone is the one who can teach us. Jesus alone is the one who can and will lead us into intimacy with God, into union with divine love. Jesus, at the end of his ministry, gives his authority, shares his authority with the 12, and he tells them, now go and teach what I have taught. Go make disciples of all the nations. Teach them what I have taught you. Teach them my commandments. And the disciples did just that. For us today, all these years later, the Catechism teaches us that the one who does this now is the one who, through a permanent and indelible mark, is configured to Christ through the sacraments of holy order. The priest, that would be me. St. Pope John Paul II writes in his pastoral letter to the bishops of the world on the formation of priests, he says this, indeed, the priest, by virtue of the consecration which he receives in the sacrament of orders, is sent forth by the Father in order to live and work by the salvation of the Holy Spirit in the service of the Church for the salvation of the world. To work by the power of the Holy Spirit, he says. Two ways, in service of the Church for the salvation of the world. And he goes on to say, without priests, the Church would not be able to live that fundamental obedience which is at the very heart of her existence and her mission in history, an obedience in response to the command of Christ. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, and do this in remembrance of me. That is, an obedience to the command to announce the gospel and to renew the daily sacrifice of giving of his body and the shedding of his blood for the life of the world. As I read those words and reread those words, I'm struck by the enormity of them, the power of them, the breadth of them, the scale of the job at hand to spread the gospel and to renew the daily sacrifice, giving the body and shedding the blood. That immensity of that reality never really hit me when I was ordained 28 years ago. As I lay there on the cathedral floor while the choir sang the litany of the saints, praying, Lord, help me to be a good and holy priest. And it wasn't until I stood at the altar of St. Joseph's Church in Ashland, where I was pastor for the first time, that the power and the enormity of this whole job really hit me. Something else that I've learned that John Paul has said about the pastor, your first duty as pastor is not projects and organizations, but to lead your people to a deep intimacy with God. And as a pastor, it's so easy to get caught up in projects and organizations and to forget about that intimacy. But isn't it true? You who are faithful Catholics, don't you really expect only one thing from your priest, from your pastor? Don't you really want him to be a specialist in promoting the encounter between you and God, that encounter that you seek every time you come to church? Several years ago, I asked the folks who attend daily Mass to do a little homework assignment. I really forget what the gospel was at the time, but the assignment I remember, and it was, what do you want from your priest? What do you want your priest to be? Not just me, but any priest. What do you want your priest to be for you? Many people responded to that, and of course I encourage you to do the same. Do that, answer that question, and give the answer to your priest. You don't need to write your name on the paper, but just let him know what you want from your priest. I bet that your response is going to be the same as the response of those people, dozen or so, that handed me that piece of paper. In different words, they all said basically the same thing. They wanted an expert in the spiritual life. They wanted someone who was holy. They wanted someone who knew how to initiate people into the Paschal mystery, the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But here's the challenge. That alone is an enormous job, and it's difficult. And how can I, as a pastor, do that and at the same time be a maintenance man and a musician, an administrator, a receptionist, a publisher, a human resource director, an accountant, a psychologist, a grass cutter, a cemetery care person, whatever else happens to land on my desk in the course of a given day? It's simply impossible. And that's why here at St. John the 23rd Parish, we have a parish staff, people who are employed by the parish to help me get all of this work done. For those of you that get the parish newsletter, it's at the printer right now, and yes, I publish that. That's one of the things that I do. You'll get it sometimes next week, but take a look on the front page and get to know the names of our parish staff. They're good people who are really committed to the mission of our parish community. For my part, you can expect, though, that I will take time every day in prayer. It's important. It's important that I do that. And I pray for you. I pray also that I can grow in my relationship with God, in my intimacy with God, so that I can teach you to do the same. In return, I ask your prayers for me so that I'm not distracted from this task. There's so many things that are distracting for a priest, for a pastor. But it's my desire not to be distracted from this task so that our parish can indeed be a true school of prayer.